This right here, you guys, is Portra 400, one of the best and most versatile color films available on the market today. So in this episode, I'm going to be offering up some of my personal tips to achieve the best results with Portra 400. We're going to talk about how to meter it, some mistakes to avoid, because with Portra 400, you guys, you're going to be getting what I feel like is the best looking film. So without further ado, let's jump into some Portra 400 tips.
This episode is brought to you by Squarespace.
So these last couple of months, you guys, I have been stocking up on some Portra 400, and I think right now I'm sitting on a backlog of over 30 rolls of Portra. And it got me thinking, you know, maybe I should make a video talking about my personal tips that I would use when I'm going out to shoot this film, because there are definitely little things that I do differently than just shooting it at box speed that I want to share with you guys. So let's just jump right in. First things first, go grab your camera so you have something to hold in your hands as we walk through each of these tips. Tip number one, you guys, is to overexpose your film by rating it at 200 ISO. Now this can be a little bit controversial because a lot of people just like to shoot Portra 400 at box speed, but personally for me, I have gotten the best results when it's overexposed by at least one stop. All you have to do, you guys, is go into your camera's light meter and set your light meter to 200 ISO rather than the 400 ISO that it is box speed. This way your camera's meter is going to meter everything for 200 ISO, in result giving your film an overexposure of one stop. Now why do I do this, folks? Well, it's simple. Portra is a professional film from Kodak that really retains a lot of detail in the highlights. And so even if you overexpose some of the highlights, you're gonna be able to retain a lot of detail within them, and you minimize the risk of completely blacking out your shadows. Now the reason why I love Portra 400 so much is because it's extremely consistent. It's also one of those film stocks that is completely neutral. You don't get really warm tones or really cool tones. It stays right in the middle. You know, when I think of film photography, the first film that I think of is Portra 400, and so it's natural that it's pretty much the industry standard when it comes to 35mm film stocks. And that leads us into tip number two: expose for your shadows. Now, exposing for your shadows is something that I feel like you should always do with any film, but particularly with Portra 400, if you expose only for the highlights, sometimes your shadows can get extremely dark. Your shadows can get extremely yellow from the color shifts, and that's just a natural effect that comes with underexposing this film stock. As some of you may know, Portra 400 is a yellow based film, and so any type of underexposure will result in some type of color shift, sometimes yellow and sometimes even red and magenta. Now, how do you expose for your shadows, folks? Well, it's simple. First, go to a contrasty scene and identify your different sections. You have your highlights, which should be nice and bright. This is typically the sun or the clouds in the sky, or just some available light that is shining directly hard onto a subject. Your shadows, of course, is self-explanatory. It's the shadows within the frame. And so the easiest way to do this is when you have your camera at your face, point your camera to the shadows and get a reading from that specific area and make sure there's no highlights involved in that particular scene. Get the reading from those shadows and take the overall image. Take your camera back and compose with your highlights included, and you will be photographing with the settings that you use that were taken from the reading in your shadows. And this way your shadows will be nicely exposed, and your highlights, because Portra 400 is an amazing film, it will retain all of those highlights and detail. Now the next tip, you guys, is something that I feel like everyone should try, especially for those of you guys who like to shoot with more contrasty scenes or maybe even at nighttime. But before we get into that, I want to give a huge thank you and shout out to our sponsor for this episode, the good folks over at Squarespace. Squarespace is your all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and run your business. Now, running a photography business can be difficult, especially in the digital age, but luckily there are services like Squarespace that allow you to be able to create your own professionalized website within minutes. You have options for a ton of award-winning templates that you can use to get started. You can also create an e-commerce shop, your own dedicated portfolio page, and probably one of my newest favorite features, the appointment scheduling tab, where you can select different slots of time for your clients to see when you are available to book directly via your website. So if you guys want to get started with your own personalized website today, head over to squarespace.com/KingJapes and enter promo code KingJapes at checkout, and you guys can get 10% off your first purchase of a domain or your own professional website. Huge thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring today's episode. Now tip number 3, you guys, is going to be pushing Portra 400 to 800 or even 1600 ISO. Now typically I wouldn't consider pushing, color film C41 if it's not a professional film, just because, for example, Fuji Superior pushed to 1600 doesn't always look too great. The exposure latitude on that film isn't the best. But with Portra 400, it actually handles pushing really good. So I've shot Portra 400 at 1600 and it for sure gives out a different feel. It doesn't give you that almost like super warm, light, airy feel, but you're gonna get a lot more contrast, a lot deeper saturation, and this all has to do with the push processing. When you underexpose this film, the colors get a lot more saturated, but that also comes with the cost of a yellow tint sometimes, and so you wanna be careful with that when you're shooting this film stock at, let's say, 800 ISO, you don't underexpose it even more than it needs to. The lab is only going to know that you pushed it to 800 ISO, so they're gonna leave it in the developer for a little bit longer, but if you underexpose past that, it's on you. So when you do push Portra to 800 or 1600 ISO, still use the same techniques. Try to expose for your shadows and really feed this film as much light as possible. Tip number 4, you guys, is pretty self-explanatory, but it's to utilize this film in a variety of different settings. So Portra 400, even though it kind of has the word portrait inside of the name, it's actually really good for things like landscapes, street photography, architecture. I mean, you name it, Portra 400 is, in my opinion, the most versatile film stock. Now, because it is a little bit more expensive, I kind of understand why a lot of people would want to save this film stock for maybe just shooting portraits, but if you can get your hands on some and try to shoot it in different settings, you will not be disappointed. As a matter of fact, Portra 400 is now one of my go-to film stocks when I create work for a book project or a zine. It's just a very consistent film that's going to give you really good results every time, and the overall look is so neutral that you don't get any crazy color shifts like you would in something like Lomo 800 or in Fuji Superior. Not to dive too much into it, but I've done tons of landscapes with this film stock, even long exposures, and it turned out really good, really nice popping saturated colors from that super long shutter speed. I've done tons and tons of portraits with this film. It's my go-to portrait film when it comes to 35mm film stocks, and this is probably the king of all street photography films because it just gives you this look that can't really be replicated with digital. I mean, you can get pretty close, but Portra 400 in itself speaks for itself when a lot of people try to, create these simulations to match the look of it. So if you can get the chance to shoot Portra 400 across the board, definitely try it out. And the last tip that I have for you guys is when you're shooting portraits, try to shoot this film stock backlit. Now, you definitely don't need to do this every single time, but this is going to be going for a very specific look. So let's set up the scene. You have the sun in the background, and then you have your subject or subjects standing right in front of it. Obviously, your camera might just automatically expose for the highlights just because it's kind of in the direct sun, but you want to override that and try to expose purely for the shadows, which is going to be their face. Once you do that, you guys, having a backlit photo with Portra 400, there's almost this halo that surrounds the couple. I shoot a lot of couples with Portra 400, so that's why I'm using that as an example. And it's just amazing what this film looks like when shot backlit, especially during a time like golden hour where the sun is about to set. Tons of warm tones, tons of really great saturation. It just looks like a fairy tale. It is magical. So this is one situation, very specific situation, that I really love the look of Portra 400 in. And if you can remember all the things we talked about in today's episode, the next time you go out with this roll of film, you are going to achieve some of the best looking images. But that's going to wrap up my Portra 400 tips. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know in the comment section down below if you guys have any other things you want to add to this list. It'd be great to learn and hear from you guys as well. But I'll see you guys in the next one, man. As always, Minolta Gang.